that happened this week. Paul Schaefer, the head of Colonia Dignidad in Chile for many years, has been captured in Argentina and deported back to Chile to face charges of child molestation, torture, and murder in Colonia Dignidad. Allegations being made by the Chilean prosecutors. There is a groundswell of support building for him on U.S. skeptical websites on saying Colonia Dignidad was nothing but a little Christian community. The truth is that Colonia Dignidad may well have been an outsourcing location for CIA torture for many, many years. The CIA may have been using Colonia Dignidad as a center of torture outside of the United States, something we have just recently been discovering the CIA did a lot of for a long time. Therefore, the skeptics' websites, etc., that are CIA-controlled are going to be saying Colonia Dignidad was innocent. Now let's see what Peter Levenda has to say about that. Peter Levenda is the author of the legendary book about post-World War II Nazi influence, The Unholy Alliance, and he is the author of an extraordinary 3-volume, upcoming, gigantic book, Sinister Forces, the first volume of which is going to be published this May. Here's Peter.
Paul Schaefer was an officer with the Luftwaffe during World War II with the German Air Force. Reports say that he was a medic with the German Air Force, not a particularly exalted title or position at the time. However, in the 1960s, he had to flee Germany because of allegations of child abuse. There were a number of questions about his abuse of children and kidnapping of children in Germany in the early 1960s. He left Germany and wound up in Chile, purchasing an estate which he renamed Colonia Dignidad, which means the Dignity Colony, Colony of Dignity or Colony of Righteousness. It's 35,000 acres, and it's in a very remote location in the south of Chile, near the town of Parral. Now, Schaefer in Germany was allegedly a kind of Baptist minister, and his colony is supposed to be a religious commune. Well, I first became aware of the colony through a book by Ladislas Farago called Aftermath. It was about the Nazis in hiding after World War II and the rat lines that were able to move the Nazis out of Germany so they could avoid prosecution, and wound up all throughout South America and in other countries. So I went down to check it out back in 1979, and I just wandered in there on a Sunday morning and eventually was apprehended by the members of the colony, and my passport was confiscated, and I was asked a lot of questions by Paul Schaefer. Since then, Amnesty International, the CIA in its own studies of the colony, and a lot of other organizations have exposed the fact that the Colonia Dignidad was a center for torture and interrogation during the Pinochet regime, the torture and interrogation of political prisoners. The interrogation cells were actually devised and designed by an American, Michael Vernon Townley, who was involved in the assassination of Orlando Letelier in Washington, D.C. a few years after the overthrow of President Allende in 1973. So the colony is a pro-Nazi operation. There's going to be a lot of restructuring of history, of revisionist history going on about the colony as Paul Schaefer is brought to justice now. He was captured in Argentina about a week or so ago. He's been deported back to Chile to stand trial for the charges against him. When I say revisionist history, people are going to say the colony was a religious commune, that it was Christian in nature, that they didn't harm anyone, when all the evidence points to the contrary.
I can tell you right now, you're not going to hear a thing about this on any other radio broadcast in the English-speaking world. So you support this radio program and this website. You do that right now. Listen to this. Well, Graham Phillips is back with us, and I'm delighted because it's always a high adventure when you talk to Graham. Graham has been on the program twice for Atlantis and the 10 Plagues of Egypt, and for the Chalice of the Magdalene, the search for the cup that held the blood of Christ. Well, Graham Phillips is still searching. He is now on to the Templars and the Ark of the Covenant, the discovery of the treasure of Solomon. Graham is talking to us from Coventry, England, and he is Not an armchair adventurer. We don't like too much to talk to armchair adventurers on Dreamland. Talk to a few of them, but we basically like to talk to people who go there and do that, and that is exactly what you are. Is that right, Graham?
Yeah, I think you could describe me as an adventurer. I have been described by some of the press as a real-life Indiana Jones, so I suppose I'm the nearest thing you're going to get.
Okay, well, let's now. This quest has been undertaken quite a few times in history. And I must say, by the way, the Templars and the Ark of the Covenant reads like something that would have been written by Indiana Jones. It's really loads of fun. In any case, this quest has been undertaken. Another Graham Hancock, early in his career, undertook a quest in search of the Ark of the Covenant. Now, before we get into where this quest led you and what makes this whole thing so special, which it certainly is, let me ask you, what about the Ark? What did it do? And what might it have been? So first, why don't you describe what it did? What did the Ark do?
Well, the first thing is not to confuse the Ark of the Covenant with Noah's Ark. Noah's Ark was the boat which the animals all went into during the Great Flood, supposedly, according to the Bible. But the Ark of the Covenant was said to have been a golden chest around about 2 or 3 feet high, 2 or 3 feet wide, about 4 feet long. And on top of it was supposed to have been carved 2 golden angels. And inside it were kept the 10 Commandment tablets, the 2 tablets of stone on which the 10 Commandments were inscribed that were said to have been given to Moses on top of Mount Sinai. But that's not all it was. It was made by Moses and the other Israelites when they were wandering in the wilderness after they escaped from slavery in Egypt, somewhere around about 1350 BC, thereabouts. And it's, of course, contained the 2 tablets of the 10 Commandments, but it was also supposed to have been some sort of holy weapon, because the Bible describes it as being carried before the armies of the Israelites and somehow managing to destroy the opposition. When the Philistines, for example, one of their enemies, attacked them, some think that it's described as the glory of the Lord, or divine fire, seems to have come out of the ark and basically leveled the opposing army. On other occasions, people who opened the ark to look into it without the protection of special prayers and other sorts of things that were supposed to have protected the priesthood, immediately dropped dead when they open it. But it's not only supposed to be a holy weapon, it was also said to have been something like, as it's described in the Indiana Jones film, a radio for talking to God. In other words, throughout the Old Testament, you get various prophets, such as Moses, who talk to God, and God reveals his plan for the Israelites. Well, most of these conversations with God are taking place by the Ark of the Covenant, and God is said to somehow speak through it, and sometimes he's even said to appear there, or at least something described as the glory of the Lord appears as some sort of divine fire above the Ark itself. So basically, in short, it was a holy weapon and a radio for talking to God.
That's absolutely fascinating. Now let's get back to the holy weapon aspect of it, because it's tantalizingly similar in the way it's described to what certain modern things might do, and also similar in certain ways to the Vedic literature, to the bizarre weapons technology that's described in the ancient Indian literature as well. Specifically, I refer to the idea that it might have been some kind of a particle beam weapon, even that was used, that was generated by a high intensity field of some kind. Could have been radioactive, could have been microwaves. How do you respond to the possibility that you're looking at a description of what was actually some sort of high-tech device that included an ability to communicate with somebody, as well as a
futuristic weapon of mass destruction sort of thing? Well, yeah, first of all, when I first investigated the Ark, I kind of thought, well, this is obviously the way that it's being portrayed, and a lot of these things were presumably myths and legends. I mean, I was originally looking at it as simply an artifact that existed in ancient Israel, and one which was obviously considered to be very holy, and that these myths and legends about what it could do had built up around it. So I was just looking for the artifact itself as an ancient, some revered object rather than something that actually had any power. But interestingly, what happened when I was researching the history of the Ark started to make me think that there might have been something to the fact that it really could have been some sort of futuristic weapon of some kind. Firstly, the only thing that's described actually being inside the Ark are the 2 stones of the 10 Commandments. Now, the interesting thing is, firstly is that these were supposed to have been cut from the living rock on top of Mount Sinai. Now, no one actually knows really where that is. There's somewhere in Egypt today which is called Mount Sinai, but that was only thought to have been that since Roman times. The Bible doesn't actually say specifically where it is. You have to do quite a lot of clue solving in the Old Testament to find out where that is at all. But I came across a place which I think is the original Mount Sinai, which is a mountain called Jebel Madaba, which basically means something along the lines of the holy place, which is in southern Jordan. And the number of reasons why I think that might be the original Mount Sinai is because it exactly matches the descriptions in the Bible. For example, the Bible describes Mount Sinai as having this great big flat area, this terrace below the summit, upon which God is supposed to have stood. Well, on Jebel Madaba, there is a terrace that has been estimated to be cut there by the hand of man around about 3,500 years ago, and there are 2 huge obelisks there which are still described in the Arabic language as the feet of God. So there are many things like that that make me think that this is actually the real mountain where Moses received the 10 Commandments. Now, if that's true, then the type of rock that is on top of Mount Sinai is what the stones were made of that were put inside the Ark. Now, these stones appear to have some rather strange properties. Many people today claim to witness strange balls of light that appear on top of this mountain, and various scientists have done research and have concluded this might be something that they describe as a geoplasma. Basically, some sort of some properties of these particular types of rocks, which are made of a certain type of sandstone, can produce electrical energy under certain conditions. In certain, if there's been a lot of rainfall, if there's been electrical phenomena in the atmosphere, such as lightning and so forth, these can produce this strange ball lightning effect, which they call geoplasma. Now, there are theories that if you could actually somehow manage to use this energy that's somehow produced by these rocks, you could produce some kind of geoplasmic generator. And one of the ways in which this is done, supposedly, or the theories go, is that it could be encased in an insulator such as gold. So you would have these rocks put inside a gold container. Obviously, there'd be other things involved too, but that would then produce some sort of balls of energy that you could actually use for some purpose or other. Well, this does sound remarkably like the Ark as it's described in the Old Testament, a golden chest which the 2 commandment stones, made from the stone from the top of this mountain, are placed inside. So, I don't know, it did sound to me as if there could be a possibility, even though I was very skeptical at first, that the Ark could have been some sort of futuristic device years ahead of its time.
Or it could be that it was very much of its time in the sense that it was a harnessing of a natural energy, maybe a technique that comes from ancient Egypt, because there are certain bas-reliefs in Egypt, particularly I refer to the ones at Abydos, that do look, with big, what look like almost like large vacuum tubes even, with big cables coming out of them, that suggest a possible knowledge of a harnessing of certain energies that has been lost simply because it was very secret and kept within a priesthood. Maybe these are stories these are things that Moses took with him out of Egypt, and it gets me to Moses and who you think Moses might be.
Well, in the Old Testament, he's said to have been, although he was an Israelite, from a child who was brought up as an Egyptian prince. The Pharaoh, for some reason or other, decides he wants to kill off a number of the Israelite babies, and Moses' mother manages to save him by putting him in a basket made of bulrushes and floats him on the River Nile. And when he's floating down the River Nile, the Egyptian princess, the daughter of the Pharaoh, finds the baby and then raises him as her own son. So he's brought up as an Egyptian prince. Eventually, when he grows up, he discovers who he is and has sympathy with the slaves, the Israelite slaves in Egypt. And this eventually causes him to fall out with the Pharaoh, who exiles him and sends him out of Egypt. And then later he returns.
My point is that during his youth and his growing up period, he would have had access to extraordinary amounts of Egyptian knowledge because of his position in the society. And I guess I'm wondering, what do you give us well, actually, you're going to have to do this after we come back from our break, but when we do come back from our break, we're going to find out from Graham exactly what the degree to which he thinks the Ark is real, or is it a fable or an important piece of mythology? This is Whitley Strieber. It's Dreamland. We'll be right back. This is Whitley Strieber. It's Dreamland. I'm talking to Graham Phillips, an extraordinary book, The Templars and the Ark of the Covenant, Graham's adventures in attempting to discover the treasury of Solomon, no less. And Graham, let's talk a little bit about the Ark, and then we're going to get to the Hybaru people and who they may actually have been, because I've always understood that most of the Old Testament is really basically fiction, that it's a novel. I mean, the historical parts of it. So, do you think the Ark was a physical object? Did you come to that point finally?
Well, one of the reasons I came to the conclusion that it might really genuinely have been a physical artifact is because so many other things in the Bible have, over the years, been shown by archaeology to be true, where people thought before they were just myths or fables. I mean, for example, people thought that King Solomon's temple, the way that it was built and so forth, was actually a myth, whereas the latest archaeology shows that much of what's said in the Bible is absolutely right. There are other things that sound like myths in the Bible, such as the fact that the 10 plagues of Egypt, which I was talking about on your show before, just sounded too ridiculous to be true. The fact that, for example, that the daytime turned to night for days on end, and fiery hailstones fell from the sky. Well, a volcanic eruption that occurred around that time, where the volcanic ash blew over Egypt, could have caused exactly as is described in the Old Testament.
Now,
so there are many things.
Graham, let's run through that. It's an absolutely fascinating part of the book. I was going to get to that. But why don't you, just since you brought it up, tell us now why the plagues described in the Bible are such an exact representation of a volcanic eruption, the effects of a volcanic eruption, where and when that eruption might have taken place, and do throw in the insects. It's really interesting.
Oh, yes. Well, firstly, I mean, the Bible says when Moses returns to Egypt, he goes to the Pharaoh and he says, set my people free. In other words, the Israelites, and the Pharaoh won't do it. And Moses says, well, God will bring plagues upon Egypt if you don't. And the Pharaoh doesn't take any notice. And then these 10 plagues do descend upon Egypt. Now, they are described as being, firstly, they've said that the sky goes dark for days on end. Then what happens is these fiery hailstones descend from the skies. The cattle in the field just fall over and die for no apparent reason. And the Nile turns to blood. Well, at around the time that this is set, as I say, roughly around about 1350 to 1400 BC, there was a massive volcanic eruption in the Mediterranean on an island called Thera. And this is known from archaeological evidence that this volcano was absolutely huge, much bigger than Mount St. Helens that erupted in Washington State in 1980. And it blew a massive cloud of volcanic ash right over Egypt. This is known from pumice samples found on the seabed of the Mediterranean and so forth. Now, the aftermath, for example, of the Mount St. Helens eruption made it go as dark as night 500 miles away from the volcano because of this huge cloud of fallout ash. Egypt is around about 500 miles, the coast of Egypt, from the volcano. So this is a much larger volcano, and equally the same could have happened. So it could have gone dark for days on end. Another thing that volcanic ash does is fall from the sky like fiery hailstones. Cattle in the field, because they can't get out of its way and they can't put their hands over the mouth or anything over the mouth to stop breathing in the volcanic ash, will suffocate. Another interesting thing about the particular kind of volcanic ash that came from this mountain, this volcano Thera, is that it has iron oxide in the rock. Now that's pretty much the same stuff as litters the surface of the moon, this red iron oxide dust. If that went into water, like the Nile, it would turn it blood red. And of course the Bible says that the Nile turned to blood. There are other things, as you mentioned the insects. There are the other plagues of swarms of flies.
Tell us the story of what happened in 1902 in the Caribbean on Montserrat with the flying ants, and I think it'll make it easier to understand why the Egyptians were then plagued with insects after all of this, after all these natural disasters. And of course, the iron oxide in the volcanic ash would have turned the Nile red as blood. So go ahead.
Yeah, well, of course, then you get these plagues of various insects. Now, one thing one wouldn't do normally is to associate a volcanic eruption with plagues of insects, but they are. You mentioned this eruption that was in the Caribbean. Now, what happened shortly after that eruption was these huge plagues of flying ants descended upon this island and were literally were stinging people. People were dying from ant bites. And they were actually killing babies in their cots. The reason such things happen is because when the iron oxide and other volcanic ash goes into the river system and pretty much everywhere else over the land, the whole ecosystem is disrupted. Larger predators, like fish in the water and larger land animals, are killed off or escape the area. But smaller creatures, especially insects in their egg stage, manage to survive such a thing because they're not actually having to inhale the fallout ash. Now, when they hatch, normally the larger predators would decimate them, but they're not. The larger predators aren't there to cut down the population of insects, and they swarm in vast numbers after volcanic eruptions. The same is true, of frogs as well. That's another, in Washington State after the Mount St. Helens eruption, there was a plague of frogs a few weeks later because the frog spawn hadn't been affected. Normally, frogs lay millions of eggs. Most of them are eaten by fish, and only a few survive to become tadpoles and then frogs. This wasn't happening because the fish had all been wiped out temporarily. So what happened is there was a plague of frogs over the roads that was actually causing so much problem for driving because they were being squashed that cars were literally skidding off the road. Now, this is exactly what the Bible says happened when one of the plagues in Egypt, apart from insects, was a plague of frogs that came out of the Nile and were in everybody's beds and in their bed chambers and all over the houses and everything else. So all of these plagues described in the Old Testament, that people have thought, well, that's just, a myth. Well, they all fit with what happens after a volcanic eruption, and there was a volcanic eruption at the time.
And so therefore, what we're getting is a situation where there's actually a lot of history in the Bible, and now let's talk about some of the specifics about the conquests. Obviously, the conquest of Jericho immediately comes up, and it's the strange use of the ark, I believe, in that conquest. Is that not correct, or have I got the wrong?
You're absolutely right. Yeah.
Well,
they're supposed to have used the ark, walked around the walls of Jericho with it 7 times. The priests were blowing horns and everyone was marching around behind the ark. And then the walls suddenly came crashing down and they were able to take over the city of Jericho. It was the first city the Israelites conquered when they moved into Canaan, which is roughly what's now Israel. Well, how the ark may or may not have done that, I have no idea, but the fact of the matter is that archaeology that's been conducted at the ancient site of Jericho over recent years has shown that there was a citadel there around the time that this story is set, around 1300 BC, and that for some reason, they say probably it was an earthquake, but for some reason the walls did collapse in one go. And right after that, there's evidence that the whole city was burnt, which couldn't have been done because of the earthquake. It seems to have been sacked by foreign invaders. And the next level of occupation shows that the Israelites were there. So the Israelites, historically, by proof of archaeology, did take over the city of Jericho and seem to have done so because the walls all collapsed. So again, you have something else historically which shows that the Bible isn't as fanciful as it may first appear. So it was things like this that made me think, well, maybe the ark itself, in some way, shape, or form, did really exist.
Now, I want to return now again to the mountain of God. Have you been there? You've physically been there?
Yeah, I've been to the site of Jebel Madaba, which I say is the mountain.
You say is the mountain of God. Give us a sort of subjective impression of what it's like there, because it's by the way, there's more to it than and we're going to discuss a little bit more about why he thinks that. Graham thinks that, but it's quite convincing, I must say, in your book. It does really sound like you found it. Tell us what it's like there, just as a person. How did you feel?
Well, firstly, it's in the middle of a desert, and there's basically a ring of mountains which surround an old 2,000-year-old ruined city called Petra. And this was built in Roman times, so obviously much later than the time of Moses. But you have this ruined city, and then you have to actually get to where the mountain is itself. You have to go through this gorge in the rocks, which starts off as about 20, 30 feet wide, and eventually ends up, you can stretch your arms out to either side and touch the walls, and the cliff to either side rise to hundreds of feet above you. It's known as the Seek in the Arab language, which basically means something like the dark place, and it certainly is a dark place. And then when you come out, this is the only way to get into to this valley around this old city of Petra, which is where this mountain is. The only way to get in there really is to go through this gorge. And when you come out the other end, you see right in front of you this huge sort of 200-foot monument, which is actually carved out into the rock itself. It's got pillars and it looks like the front of a temple, but it's actually carved out into the rock. Now, some people may be familiar with this if they saw the Indiana Jones film, not the Ark film, but Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, which is where he goes in search of the Holy Grail and finds it in this place in the middle of the desert. That was actually filmed where this Jebel Madaba is, and this monument I'm describing was actually the place in which, in the film, Indiana Jones finds the Grail. So,
how
that's
fascinating!
What it looks like.
That takes me down another path in a way. We'll ask you about the Indiana Jones films and just what secrets may lie behind them in just a moment. This is Whitley Strieber. It's Dreamland. We'll be right back with Graham Phillips. This is Whitley Strieber, It's Dreamland. We're talking to Graham Phillips, the Templars and the Ark of the Covenant. We're going to get into a little bit of exactly why the Templars became involved in just a minute. But before we go on with that, I have to ask you, given that you found the Mountain of God right at Petra, and the Indiana Jones film we were just talking about was filmed in Petra in part, do you think Steven Spielberg knew anything, or are the writers involved maybe have some idea?
I have no idea. I'd love to talk to them about it and find out how they got to know. I mean, maybe it was just a lucky guess, or maybe they thought it looked a spectacular piece of scenery. I don't know. But as I say, it was the Grail that they had been there, not the Ark. But it does seem remarkably coincidental.
It's very coincidental. Yeah, in fact, it's too coincidental.
Yeah, so, I'll have to find out. I don't know. I have no idea. I have no idea why they chose that place.
On that flat terrace, that flattened area on the mountain itself, with the two big obelisks on it, has there ever been any archaeology done there?
Yes, there has, and this is what's really interesting. Not only does this match, I mean, when the Israelites climbed up the mountain of God, Mount Sinai, that's also called the mountain of God, when they climbed up the mountain of God for Moses to go up and receive the Ten Commandments, Moses went up to the very top, but the other Israelite elders remained on this flat terrace, which was below the summit, which is where, as I said, where the God is said to have stood astride it. Now, I don't know in what way he was supposed to have done that, but as I mentioned before, there are these two obelisks there, which are called the feet of God in the local Bedouin. That's what they're called. Now, this was actually these are man-made obelisks, and the whole of the terrace was actually flattened out sometime around about 1500 BC, which meant it would have been there if this was the place that Moses and the Israelites went. So such a legend could have become attached to it. But the interesting thing is, in the Bible it says, when they saw God standing astride this terrace, it was, they describe, as if the terrace itself shone like sapphire stone. Now, the interesting thing is archaeology has shown that the whole terrace was once covered with a pavement of slate, blue slate, which was polished, because that's all been found in the area around around the terrace. And if it had been polished brightly, it would, in the sunlight, have shone like sapphire stone in exactly the way that the Bible describes. So it's things like that that make me absolutely certain I found the right place.
Just fascinating. Now, let's talk a little bit about some of the things that you have found. But before, I'm trying to think about how to get to the stones. First, why don't you tell us about what they were? Specifically the stones that were involved with the Ark of the Covenant.
Well, the stone, basically, the Bible says that it's not just the Ark of the Covenant alone that can produce these strange effects. The high priest, Moses' brother Aaron, and then his successors, had to wear this breastplate upon which there were 12 stones, and there are they're all described in the Old Testament: onyx, jasper, diamond, sapphire, and so forth. And they were laid out in a certain way. They were once supposedly possessed by Lucifer himself, according to the book of Ezekiel, I think it is, in the Old Testament. They were once possessed by Lucifer himself, and God gave them to him when he was an angel, in order to give him great power. But when he fell from grace and became the devil, basically, God took them from him, and then later he gives them to Moses, which he has put in this breastplate called the breastplate of judgment. And it's only the person who can supposedly, who wears this breastplate with these magic stones, if you want to call them that, on it, these sacred stones, who can actually control the power of the ark. So that's what this breastplate is. Now, throughout the Bible, eventually this breastplate is supposed to have basically worn out, and the stones were kept in a jar or a coffer, as it's described, or some kind of box, along with the Ark of the Covenant. Now, according to a book called the Book of Maccabees, which appears in some versions of the Bible, certainly the earliest versions, but it doesn't appear in the later versions of the Bible. It was considered to be a bit over the top for the Catholic. I don't know, the Catholic Church kept it. I think the Protestant Church didn't.
Yeah, I was just going to say, it's in the Catholic Bible, I think, to this day. Yeah.
Yeah, it is.
Over the top doesn't matter to the Catholics. I mean, we're ready for over the top. It's the Protestants who have a problem with that.
They basically, what it says here is that the ark itself and these stones were hidden by the high priest, the prophet, Jeremiah, who was basically in, I can't remember the exact date, 596, I think it is, BC. Until that point, the ark and these stones were kept in the Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem. Then Jerusalem was sacked and invaded by the Babylonians from what's modern Iraq, and they basically, the prophet Jeremiah had to take these objects, along with a few other things that were in the temple, away before it was sacked by the Babylonians, and he took them back to where they came from originally, which was the mountain of God, and hid them there somewhere in a cave. So that's why I was trying to find where the mountain of God was first, before I could even start looking for the ark.
And, of course, then you did find the mountain of God. And now let's talk a little bit about the journey that led you to the finding of the stones, of the three stones, which I am sitting here staring at, fascinated with the beautiful color illustration of them in your book. Where did you start on this particular part of the journey?
Well, when I was actually visiting the Petra, where this mountain is, a guide told me. I mean, I wanted to know if there was if the local Bedouin population knew anything about, associated the place with the Mountain of God. And the first thing he said was, "Yeah, we've known this for years." And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, there's a shrine at the bottom of the base of the mountain called the Spring of Moses, Ein Musa, it's called, where they say that Moses stood at the bottom of Mount Sinai and put a staff against the rock and produced a miraculous spring, which is what it describes him doing in the Bible. And they've got a little mosque there, a shrine, actually marking this spot. So I thought I'd been clever finding the Mountain of God for the first time ever, and the local population has been thinking it's been there for years. But one of those stories he told me was that the Knights Templar, the Crusader Knights from Europe, who had built a fort there to protect the local trade route through the area in the 1100s, that the story went that they actually had been looking for the lost treasures of the Israelites, as they called it, and that they had found a cave right next to this temple that's cut out of the rock, which I was telling you about, which is in the Indiana Jones film. That's called the Treasury, incidentally. Right next to that, they found somewhere a cave, and in there, and the only description is by an Arab chronicler who wrote around about 1300 AD. He wrote that they had found a golden chest and certain gemstones. Now, I thought, hold on a minute, I'm looking for a golden chest, the Ark, and these gemstones which are supposed to be with it, which are these stones from the breastplate of judgment. I thought, maybe I'm looking for something that's already been found. So I wanted to discover what the Knights Templars who were there, what they'd done with it, and the only way I could do that is to find out who they were. I traced up that they were actually a group that came from England, and from the Midlands of England, near Stratford-upon-Avon, where Shakespeare was born, and that when they were finally kicked out of the area by the Muslims, they came back to England and apparently brought these objects they found with them. So that's how I ended up tracing them to England, and I decided to find out what they'd done when they came back to this country. So that's how that started.
And you made some interesting progress here, and by the way, the book's got a nice set of illustrations in it. And one of the most remarkable ones is an illustration of Farnborough Lake, showing an actual light, a red light hanging over the water on one of the banks of the lake, reminiscent in my mind not only of all of the sort of orbs and ghost lights that we see around the world, but of the legends of what you see on the Mountain of God. And tell us a little bit about the significance of Farnborough Lake.
Well, it just so happened that lake is in a hill area called the Burton Dasset Hills in the centre of England. And this is where the Knights Templars had what they call their preceptory, which was sort of like an abbey, but because the Knights Templars were warrior monks, it was a kind of cross between a monastery and a military base. And it was here that they had a chapel built to contain what the historical records describe as Old Testament relics. In other words, they had something that they believed had been mentioned in the Old Testament, and they had this chapel built to contain these things, presumably this chest and these stones that they brought back with them. Maybe the Ark, maybe the stones from the breastplate of judgment. Now, first of all, I wondered why it was that they actually decided to build this particular preceptory and this chapel there. Well, one thing became clear, and that was that the strange lights that were seen around the area of of what I think is the Mountain of God in Jordan were also being seen around these hills in the centre of England. They've been seen for years. I mean, I'd found documented evidence, newspaper clippings and so forth, going back to the 1800s about people seeing the lights, which people call the ghost lights, that's their local name for them, on these hills, balls of different coloured lights that are seen to hover around and then shoot into the air and disappear mysteriously. Near where their chapel was, there was there's a lake, and this lake, over this lake, there's been seen these really strange lights, red and different coloured lights that hover over the lake. And the photograph that you were talking about in the book was actually taken by a student girl who was up there taking photographs one evening of the reflection of the sun in the lake, and suddenly this light appeared. She managed to take a photograph of it across the lake. But I've actually seen this myself. I went up there, but maybe I should talk about that a bit later.
Well, let's. We have.
A lot of people have.
We have to pause here. We've got a break anyway, so we'll be right back with Graham Phillips and what's getting to be a very personal adventure into the unknown in search of the lost Ark of the Covenant. This is Whitley Strieber. We'll be right back. This is Whitley Strieber. It's Dreamland, and for subscribers, we're going to continue with Graham in the subscriber section. After we have finished this program, you can listen to both shows, and I have some very surprising things to talk about in the subscriber section with Graham, so stay tuned for it and go into the subscriber section and enjoy another intimate discussion with Graham. Okay, now let's just go back, if we may, to the lake, to Farnborough Lake, and pick up where we were just about to leave off. And I have to ask you, I can't wait. What you have seen this yourself? You said this glowing light over the lake.
Yeah, I mean, many people had claimed to have seen lights around this area, and most of them had been seen near this lake. And because these were so similar to the lights that had been seen at the mountain at Petra, I thought there must be some connection. But before I jump to any conclusions, I've got to try and see these myself. And I spoke to many witnesses who swore that they'd seen them. And I decided to spend a considerable amount of time up there. For a long time, nothing was seen. But eventually, with two other friends, I went up to the lake one night, and we were just walking along the bank of the lake. It's a kind of like a U-shape, quite a large lake, and it's surrounded by trees, and you're miles, quite a long way from any other houses or roads or anything. And we're walking along the bank, and suddenly my friend, is also called Graham, was in front of me, and he suddenly said, "What's that there?" And in the darkness, it was like pitch black. I mean, we had flashlights, and we looked across to the other bank, and there was what appeared to be just a light, a little tiny red light, like as if somebody had got a cigarette over there. And I thought at first that must be somebody just standing there with a cigarette. So we turned the flashlights out, and we could just see that this light just didn't seem to move. If somebody was standing there with a cigarette, you'd have thought it'd be moving. It stayed still. And so I called across, is anybody there, and heard no reply. And then suddenly, after about 15 seconds or so, it just winked out, just went. So turned the flashlight on again and swept the other bank to see if we could see anybody there, and there was nothing there at all. And then after a few minutes, I can't remember the exact sequence of events now, but after a few minutes, suddenly our torches began to, we call them flashlights in the States, I have to remember that.
Right, flashlights.
Our flashlights began to just get dimmer and dimmer and just went out. And I was thinking, what on earth? And then suddenly this little light reappeared over the other side of the lake, and then appeared to grow in size until it was about the size of a tennis ball. And I thought, is that somebody there messing around? And then it just disappeared again, winked out, then reappeared, seemingly higher up. It was difficult to actually tell in the blackness, exactly where it was, but it seemed to be about another 5 or 6 feet in the air. Winked out, reappeared about another 5 or 6 feet to the side of that, and kept doing this for a few moments. And then this sound started, which sounded as if people were sort of like banging rocks together. And that got faster and faster until it was like almost like a machine gun sound, a sort of sound. And then this ball of red light came back on again. And then I thought at first it was getting bigger, but then realized in the darkness it was actually moving towards us. And I could see it over the middle of the lake. You could see its reflection in the lake. I mean, it was really bizarre.
Wow.
I was thinking, all that was going through my mind is, how is it staying in the air? How is it just holding? I mean, look, I always imagine if I saw one of these lights, that it would be some kind of insubstantial, kind of like misty sort of thing, like a ball of gas or something like that. But this appeared solid. It literally looked like a sort of crystal ball with like a fiery sort of, like a flames inside it. But it looked solid. It looked as if it weighed quite a lot. And yet it was just floating in the middle of the lake, and then it kind of moved closer towards us, and I felt all the hairs go up on my arms and so forth, as if I was in a field of static electricity or something. But it was only at that moment
go ahead.
that I suddenly thought, we might be in danger.
Well, of course, because you really are face-to-face with an unknown phenomenon. Our science reporter, Dreamland science reporter, Linda Moulton Howe, experienced something quite similar in the context of a crop circle, where they saw at a greater distance a group of people observed a strange red light moving in an impossible way. It was obviously not an airplane or a cigarette end or somebody with a flashlight, or a torch if you prefer. But that was farther south. That was in, I think it was in Somerset, as I recall. At night, while they were actively seeking to watch a crop circle being formed. And they didn't ever see the crop circle formed. It was carefully formed in a direction that they weren't looking at the time that it was formed. But they were there, and they did see these lights. So I wonder what we're looking at, Graham. Are we looking at the tattered edges of a long forgotten means of communicating with higher levels of reality? And let's now get into that aspect of the ark. We talked about its destructive effects, but also, of course, of vital importance to every human being on this earth, a communications device that left us with the Ten Commandments. What kind of communications device do you think it might have been?
Well, that's the bit I have no idea. All I can say is that if somehow, sorry, I keep coughing. Somehow, if the Ark was somehow able to produce this strange phenomenon that we saw at the lake, or something along those lines, I can certainly understand why people would have thought it was divine fire or some sort of appearance of God. I can also understand why it may have been thought of that it could be used as a weapon, because one of these lights that appeared at the Burton Dasset Hills in central England in the 1930s set fire to a windmill and burnt it to the ground.
Yes, and there's a picture of that windmill, or the remains of it, in the book.
That's right, yeah. I mean, there's nothing left of it now, apart from the sort of like the base of it. I remember when I saw this light, I was thinking, I thought, hold on, something like that blew apart a windmill. The same sort of thing may have been used to level the Israelite enemy armies. And just as I was thinking, I'm just going to run for it, it sort of like just shot in the air with a kind of spiraling motion into the sky and just disappeared. So I can see, from what I've seen myself, how this could have been seen to have been a manifestation of God. However, how they used the Ark, if they did, how they used it as how to communicate with some higher being or whatever they thought they were communicating with, I have no idea. All I can say is that everything about seeing this light was totally unexpected to me. Not only the fact we saw it, but then the fact that it looked different to what I imagined. I had the feeling, and I know this is totally subjective, but I had the feeling that it was almost intelligent. It's as if it seemed to be kind of observing us or something. That was just a feeling I've had. Other people have described the lights as appearing to have some intelligence. But
well, that's true. In Hessedalen in Norway, for years, there was a continuous observation of these sorts of lights that appeared just very, very regularly and functioned clearly in an intelligent manner. There's quite a long, if you look Hessedalen up on Google, I think you'll find a lot about it. So these lights are around. They also appear in crop circles, and unfortunately, we don't quite know enough to get beyond a kind of state of wonder about them. But tell me, did you try to communicate with it in any way?
Well, no, but I was just going to run for it, but it wasn't hardly there for any time at all. I mean, probably, close to us when it started moving towards us, and then it had gone. It shot into the air, spiraled away, and disappeared. But I mean, I've never managed to find anybody, a witness yet, who has actually tried to communicate with it, because a lot of them describe them as being intelligent. I never tried, but what happened was I found a group of born-again Christians who had seen one of these lights in these hills close to where their chapel was. And they genuinely thought that it was a manifestation from God. And they went over and knelt down before it as if to pray. And apparently, as they did that, it got bigger and bigger and started to change colour. So it seemed, the only thing I could... And another occasion I think it was the 1600s, there's a description of a ball of blue light appearing in a nearby church in the graveyard that was taken to be a manifestation, an appearance of the Virgin Mary. And it said that the people who saw it, again, knelt down before it thinking it was the Virgin Mary about to appear, and as they prayed, it got bigger. So in some way it seems, I mean, there's only those couple of cases to really go on, but it seems maybe that if you concentrate on these things, it does actually have some influence on it, maybe charges it up. I don't know. It's out of my field, really. I mean, I was investigating a historical mystery, not some science mystery. It may, but I didn't. I was too scared to try and communicate with it.
Well, Graham, we're coming to the end of our time together on Dreamland, but we're going to continue on in the subscriber section in just a few minutes, and we're going to be talking now more about the Templars and the wonderful, fascinating story of the Epiphany window and a gentleman named Jacob Cove Jones and some artifacts of immense importance. Exactly what did come to England? That is the question. Graham, I have not asked you yet, and I'm embarrassed about this. Do you have a website?
I do, yes. It's grahamphillips.net.
GrahamPhillips.net is Graham's website, and that website will, of course, be linkable through the Dreamland page on unknowncountry.com. But happily, it is a relatively easy one to remember. Graham Phillips, GrahamPhillips.net. And so go to GrahamPhillipsNet.net for more information. And those of you who are subscribers, get set for further adventure. Next up on Dreamland, Linda Moulton Howe. We'll be right back. You're about to experience something that you just can't get elsewhere. Emmy Award-winning science reporter Linda Moulton Howe reporting on the absolute leading edge of science discovery and the true mysteries of the unknown. Don't miss her website, earthfiles.com, the one science website that tells you the secrets the others dare not. earthfiles.com. This week, she's reporting on the first sighting of another planet light years from our solar system. Here she is from Albuquerque, Linda Moulton Howe.
Thanks, Whitley. This week, another step was taken toward finding other life in the universe. A year and a half ago, NASA launched the Spitzer Space Telescope, the largest infrared telescope ever placed in space to orbit the sun. And now, for the first time in human history, light and heat from two planets orbiting very distant stars have been directly seen by the Spitzer telescope. One of the alien suns is 150 light years away, and the other is 500 light years away. The findings mark really the beginning of a new age for planetary science, in which extrasolar planets can be directly measured and compared. In order for the Spitzer telescope to see the heat from such distant planets, the telescope must be cooled to near absolute zero so that it can observe infrared signals from space without interference from the telescope's own heat. Also, the telescope must be protected from our sun's heat and the infrared radiation from Earth. To do this, Spitzer carries a solar shield and was launched into a special orbit which places the infrared telescope far enough away from Earth to allow the telescope to stay cold without having to carry large amounts of coolant. Prior to this revolutionary breakthrough, about 130 extrasolar planets have been discovered indirectly. Until now, astronomers studied intermittent dimming in distant suns presumed to be caused by orbiting planets. Astronomers also have detected wobbles in stars caused, also presumed, by gravitational tugs of orbiting planets. But no planets could be seen. Now, Spitzer has directly observed the warm infrared glows of two planets about the size of Jupiter. Hot Jupiters are extrasolar gas giants that orbit usually quite close around their parent stars, and therefore they soak up a lot of heat that stands out very brightly in infrared wavelengths. But from Earth, over all those light years, how can scientists distinguish between the heat of the distant suns and their orbiting planets? I talked about that question this week with a planet formation theorist at the Carnegie Institution of Washington, D.C. Dr. Alan Boss has worked at the Carnegie Institution for 24 years and is so excited that at last we are directly seeing other planets.
What's happened is that 2005 is going to go down in the history books as the year in which we have our first strong evidence for actually detecting light directly from a planet outside of our solar system. As of 10 years or so ago, we really had no evidence for planets outside of our solar system, but in 1995, the first indirect evidence for having a planet outside of our solar system, at least around a sun-like star, was developed. And in the intervening 10 years, we've actually been able to find evidence for roughly 130 or so planets outside of our solar system, which is a remarkable advance. But it still has taken 10 years to get to the point where we can now actually begin to see these planets. In the past, we've been able to infer their presence by the effect that they have on their host star, but now we're actually able to see that the light from the planet is distinct from the light of the star, which is a major, major advance.
How is that accomplished?
The measurements were done by the Spitzer Space Telescope, which is an infrared wavelength telescope operating in orbit around the sun. And what was happening is that the planet, as it goes behind the sun, the star, its own sun, the amount of light that's emitted by the total system, the star plus the planet, decreases somewhat. And so when the planet comes back out again, we see the amount of light come up again, which tells us that we can actually separate, in some sense, the light of the star from the light of the planet, and that we can see the overall system get dimmer when the planet is hidden, and we see it brighten up again when the planet is revealed. And so we can subtract the two amounts of light and see exactly how much light came from the planet. And that has never been done before. And I think few people appreciate it, is that we are on the verge of finding evidence for other Earth-like planets in our neighborhood of the galaxy. That is really an incredibly profound advance in science. And if we are actually able to find some other planets nearby which look inhabitable or look like they maybe even show signs of being inhabited, I think it will have a most significant effect on all of human consciousness, to realize that our planet is not unique, that there may be other planets out there resembling our own, although perhaps in various different stages of development.
And in one of the news releases, it seemed to suggest that not only light, but that you were able to probe temperatures, emissions from the planets, and you might even be able to measure wind from far extrasolar planets?
That's true. The two teams of scientists led by David Charbonneau and by Drake Deming, they've been able to interpret their observations of these two planets in the sense of trying to understand exactly how bright the planet has to be in order to give off the amount of light that was seen. And from a fairly simple calculation, they can figure out the temperature that the planet has to have in order to give off that amount of light. That temperature then tells you something very important about what's happening in the upper atmosphere of this planet, and tells you something potentially about wind speeds and what's happening on the planet's atmosphere, which is a whole new way of probing the planets and learning more about what they might actually be like if you were able to be inside one of them.
Now, of these 130 extrasolar planets operating around or orbiting around other suns, what is the closest system that we've been able to detect other planets?
I think the closest planets are perhaps about maybe 30 light years away, something on that order. They're not terribly close. We're continuing to search for the very closest stars, because the closest stars, of course, are the ones who eventually will be able to take the closest pictures. So we haven't really gotten any very, very close by planets, but it's in part because we don't really quite have the techniques available to us to do a really in-depth survey. NASA is actually planning on launching several very capable telescopes in the next 10 years, which will be able to search the very closest stars and actually take pictures of their planets if they're there.
The closest star that I remember is about 4 light years from the Earth.
That's right. It's called Proxima Centauri. It's a member of a triple star system, and that will be a prime example to look at to see if it has planets around it. So far, people have been looking at it by the indirect methods, and they haven't found any evidence yet for any large planets, but there could very well be some lower mass planets that cannot be seen by our current techniques, but we may find them eventually.
Now, in terms of this distribution of the planets that we've seen so far, are all of them Jupiter size or larger?
Most of the planets are, yes, rather large, very comparable to the Jupiter and Saturn in our solar system. But just last fall, we actually several groups of astronomers were able to detect the presence indirectly of planets as low in mass as perhaps 15 times the mass of Earth. So they're getting down now into the range of what we might want to start calling a terrestrial-like or rocky planet. We don't really know for those objects what their composition is. We hope to find out someday. But if they truly are roughly 15 Earth masses, and if they are composed primarily of rock, then I think we have actually discovered a brand new class of planets that is planets much like the Earth, and it will give us even more excitement and more impetus for searching for Earth-like planets which are closer in size to Earth.
Mm-hmm. And that, the nearest 4 light-year star away and the others in our neighborhood, that they could have planets the size of ours, perhaps even with life forms on them. But if I understand correctly, you're saying we have not had any instrument that could find an Earth-sized planet yet.
That's exactly right. For all we know, a number of the nearby stars could have solar systems very much like our own, including even the giant planets. We're just now getting to where searches have been going on for long enough to reveal the rather long-term effects that a Jupiter-mass planet would have on its host star. You basically have to follow stars for 12 years or so, because that's the period of Jupiter's orbit. And we're just now getting far enough into the search that we can hope to find nearby stars that have large Jupiters. But in addition, we have no capability whatsoever of finding Earth-mass planets on Earth-like orbits. That is going to be a task for the future, and NASA is planning several missions that will be able to do that. So within the next 10 years or so, we should actually be able to see if there are Earth-like planets around nearby stars as well as somewhat more distant stars.
It's exciting, and you are, in your specialty at the Carnegie Institution, a planet formation theorist. And what I wonder, I just came back from the Lunar and Planetary Institute week-long conference in Houston, and one of the biggest mysteries in terms of the evolution of our own solar system are all those moons around Saturn, and specifically Iapetus, that seems to have this 12-mile-high ring that goes right at its equator. Have you studied that, and would you have any hypothesis as a planet formation theorist about how that could have formed?
I don't have an explanation for Iapetus' ring. That certainly is a major mystery. But as far as we know, these extrasolar planetary systems are going to have planets which have satellite systems around them and rings and so on, just like the planets within our solar system. So those will be even more difficult to detect, but there's no reason why we shouldn't expect to find them. As a theorist, I should point out that those of us who worry about planet formation pretty much have our hands full just trying to understand how the planets themselves form. We haven't quite yet got to the point where we can understand, in general, the formation of their satellite systems. Now, in the case of the Earth's moon, there's a very good theory evolved for how the moon formed, but in terms of forming the regular and irregular satellites of the outer planets, Jupiter and Saturn, Uranus and Neptune, we're just beginning to scratch that problem.
And do you think that the moon that orbits Earth came from our own planet in some violent event?
Yes, actually, back in the early 1980s, there was a major conference in Hawaii, the Kona Conference, that really produced pretty much a consensus view on the origin of our moon, that it arose from a giant impact, that is, an impact between a roughly Mars-sized body with the growing Earth. And that's become essentially the conventional wisdom, and it has not really been challenged ever since. So for the last 20 years, essentially everyone who worries about the formation of the moon has been working in the context of understanding how these giant impacts would produce a moon-like satellite to the Earth.
If there was an extrasolar planet that had oceans, say similar to the Earth, would we, in these with this new instrumentation, be able to tell if there was liquid water on a faraway planet?
That is one of the major goals for the spacecraft that NASA, as well as the European Space Agency, are planning on launching in the next 10 years or so. They will be able to detect the presence of water vapor in the atmospheres of the planets that they see, because we know that water is a prerequisite, at least for life as we know it. And so that is one of the major thrusts for being able to characterize planets around other stars is trying to see not only what the planet is like in terms of its mass and orbit, to see if that orbit is orbiting where water would remain liquid, but we also want to see direct evidence for water in the atmosphere of that planet.
It's ironic, isn't it, that we will have the challenge of looking for water on extrasolar planets, light years from our solar system, while we are challenged by even trying to understand Mars' water history.
Exactly right. So we certainly will make tremendous progress, though, on Mars, because NASA has really focused on following the water in Mars and now has a rather major program underway for a series of rovers which will be going to Mars, and eventually, hopefully, some astronauts will be walking there as well. And so the time has come in the history of human evolution for us to reach out beyond the Earth-Moon system, to go beyond the events of 1969 when Neil Armstrong first stepped on another body in our solar system, and move on to the phase where we begin exploring beyond Earth-Moon orbit and understand more about the possible prevalence of life in our solar system.
Do you think in this century that we will see those headlines, life on Mars or life on another planet?
Oh, most definitely. This century is quite young. It's only being 2005. So if you give me 95 years, that's, in scientific terms, that's an incredible amount of time. If you try to go back 95 years in time, you think what we knew of 95 years ago, we knew very little. And the amount of knowledge that we have is growing in something like an exponential fashion. And that means that we certainly will be able to have information about planets outside of our solar system, what their atmospheres are like within the next 10 or 20 years at the most. And the plans for getting to Mars and understanding Mars are certainly going to come to fruition in the next few decades. So if you're giving me a 95-year time interval, I would say yes, we will most likely know within that time period if we are alone in the solar system and the universe or not.
Well, the NASA Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, known as SETI, and now operating as an independent body, has been looking for a variety of radio signals and chemistry signals for a long time. And it's my understanding that we're putting TV and radio signals and all of that out from the Earth out into the universe on a constant basis. Why do you think that we haven't seen signs of some other kind of radio signals that would fall into the category of intelligence?
It's very difficult to detect radio or television signals from another planet because the signals, even though they're leaving the Earth, are actually quite weak because they were not intended to be beamed out to space. So even though an advanced civilization on a nearby star might be now watching many years of I Love Lucy reruns, in fact, they would have to have an incredibly huge telescope to be able to detect those. So in order really to detect signals from a technologically advanced civilization, basically they would have to be beaming a signal directly towards us with a rather large radio telescope of their own. They would have to be intentionally sending the radiation right in our direction so that we could pick it up. And even if we wanted to do that ourselves, if we wanted to broadcast our presence to the rest of the galaxy, we would have to have a large number of dedicated radio telescopes sweeping through the galaxy at the literally billions of stars and pinpointing them one after the other and sending them a signal and hoping that someone happened to be listening at the same time. So if you think about the immensity of the galaxy and the number of stars and not knowing ahead of time where life is, it is really a quite difficult problem to expect to have heard from another civilization by now, or to expect another civilization to hear from us. That's not to say that it can't be done. Definitely the search should be continued, but it's not that surprising, I would say, that we have not heard yet.
There was a science friend of mine who said, in a kind of ironic way, but it made me think, he said, we don't know what intelligence would be like on another planet, and if they were all telepathic, they wouldn't have any need for communicating with radio signals.
Well, I wouldn't want to suggest telepathy as a replacement for direct communication, but certainly one has to worry about whether or not civilizations want to communicate or whether or not they have finite lifetimes. There's always the problem that if we somehow manage to do ourselves in through global warming or through a comet impact or something like that perhaps we're not going to be around that much longer, at least not in a state able to have high technology radio communication devices, and that perhaps the problem with not hearing from someone else is simply due to the finite lifetime of civilizations. That's a pretty apocalyptic approach to things. I tend to be more cheerful than that in life, so I hope that someday we'll find a signal.
But what you mean is that there could already have been sophisticated civilizations that rose in their bell-shaped curve of survival and went extinct.
Oh, I think that's most likely the case. If it really is true that life can evolve elsewhere, then I think it's hard to imagine that has not happened.
And that there could be planets out there with life where our life was millions and millions of years ago, starting on their upward arc, and that where we begin, like humans, we keep wanting to find ourselves somewhere on another planet reflected in the universe, but in fact the universe may be a buzzing, booming place of so many different stages of life.
Absolutely, that's certainly true. The rise of life and intelligence on our planet took hundreds of millions of years, and there's no reason to think that all of these planets are synchronized in their life evolution process, and so we should expect, if we could actually sample a number of such planets, to find them in all stages of evolution. We should find some that are sort of zoological parks where just early creatures are beginning to crawl around. We should find some that are more archaeological sites where one could go and examine what had happened in the distant past.
And string theory and quantum physics keeps coming up with these very provocative potential. They don't violate anything in known physics about time travel into the future, and an implication that there could actually be other civilizations that are very advanced at a different area in the timeline, and that they could be time travelers to us.
Yeah, I don't think I really want to go there. I'm too much of a hard-nosed physicist to believe in time travel, I'm afraid.
But you know that is discussed by people who are writing in string theory and quantum physics.
Yeah, and that's not a sort of physics that I participate in. I tend to work in physics that is a little bit more grounded in reality. Unfortunately, string theory is still extraordinarily hypothetical by definition, and I always thought working on extrasolar planets was a pretty far-flung enterprise, but it turned out to actually be grounded in reality, and that's where I prefer to devote my efforts.
Well, look how mainstream you have become.
Exactly.
While string theory and quantum physicists are still describing things that may become just as mainstream in the future.
That's certainly true. Well, certainly quantum physics is still very well rooted in observational experiments one can perform in the lab. I think string theory is yet to be able to show that it can make a prediction, perhaps, that could be observationally verifiable. It will be something to look forward to in the future if it can be done. The next major event, perhaps, will be the launch of NASA's Kepler telescope in roughly 2007 or so. The Kepler mission will be designed to find Earth-like planets by transit. That is, by watching the planets pass in front of their star and dim the starlight for a short period of time, and then periodically come back and dim it again as they orbit around and around. And so Kepler, hopefully, will by the year 2009 or 2010 or so, give us some indication of how many Earth-like planets are out there. That is, an Earth-mass planet orbiting on a one-year period around a sun-like star. That'll be a very important number to know, because if it turns out that Earth-like planets are quite frequent and quite commonplace, then it will be quite easy to find them to go to the next step. But if it turns out that Earths are somewhat rare, that means it will be quite a bit more difficult in order to detect them.
And before the 2007 NASA Kepler telescope launch, there is the Allen telescope array that's coming online this year, if all goes well. This is financed by Paul Allen and Nathan Myhrvold, who made their fortunes at Microsoft, and they have been involved in the construction at the Hat Creek Radio Observatory in Northern California, where the University of California currently operates an array that observes at millimeter wavelengths. This new Allen telescope array joins the search for extraterrestrial intelligence in the universe and will consist of 350 individual 20-foot antennas linked to form the equivalent of a large single antenna. And when this is fully functional, the Allen telescope array will have more collecting area than the newly completed Green Bank telescope in West Virginia, and it will have better resolution than the Arecibo dish in Puerto Rico that has long been used by SETI to search for extraterrestrial life in the universe. Then, if all goes well, around 2010, there will be a mission called the Space Interferometer. It's known as SIM, and it's going to look also for Earth-like planets, or they say planets maybe as small as 3 to 10 times the mass of the Earth around nearby stars. And it's going to look for them indirectly, again looking at what could be planetary transits and the wobble of suns. And then, by 2015, there will be a terrestrial planet finder coronagraph that will be launched. This is a very large optical telescope in space, and it will be able to take pictures of a planet and separate out the starlight from the host star. And so, this past week, there has been this announcement that we have finally been able to see the heat and light of a distant planet. If all goes well, by 2015, we will be able to take pictures of distant alien planets surrounding their stars. What a time, Whitley, to be alive.
Oh, Linda, it's so amazing. Two things come to mind. First, if we're this far along, they must be as well and even farther. And two, we will be able, by analyzing the light from these planets, to determine the probability of life being present there. It's hard on a planet like Mars, where life is at best very sparse, but on a planet that is richly endowed with life like Earth is, it would be possible, by examining its reflected light, to determine whether or not there was life there. So we may know, even before we know whether or not there's life on Mars, that there is life on a planet orbiting another star. Linda, it has been so exciting to talk to you. This is a real mind opener. It excites the imagination so wonderfully well. Next week on Dreamland, I'm going to be interviewing William Henry about his incredible new DVD that is actually available from our store right now. William has delved into the symbols and the secret meaning of the American Republic as it was intended by the Founding Fathers. It is absolutely riveting. A Nation Under God, one of the best and most beautifully produced DVDs of its kind you'll ever see. Then later, we're going to have Stephen Sora coming up on Dreamland. Kurt Leland's coming back, and an old friend, Peter Lavenda, who has written an incredibly powerful new book, a gigantic book called Sinister Forces, will be starting by talking to us in the subscriber section. And this week in the subscriber section, don't miss the continuation of the interview with Graham Phillips as he actually finds those stones. And what do you think happens when he uses them? We have evidence of an actual physical phenomenon described in the Bible manifesting in these stones in modern times. Don't miss
what it could do had built up around it. So I was just looking for the artifact itself as an ancient, some revered object rather than something that actually really had any power. But interestingly, what happened when I was researching the history of the art started to make me think that there might have been something to the fact that it really could have been some sort of futuristic weapon of some kind. Firstly, the only thing that's described actually being inside the ark are the two stones of the Ten Commandments. Now, the interesting thing is, firstly is that these were supposed to have been cut from the living rock on top of Mount Sinai. Now, no one actually knows really where that is. There's somewhere in Egypt today which is called Mount Sinai, but that was only thought to have been that since Roman times. The Bible doesn't actually say specifically where it is. You have to do quite a lot of clue solving in the Old Testament to find out where that is at all. But I came across a place which I think is the original Mount Sinai, which is a mountain called Jebel Madaba, which basically means something along the lines of the holy place, which is in southern Jordan. And the number of reasons why I think that might be the original Mount Sinai is because it exactly matches the descriptions in the Bible. For example, the Bible describes Mount Sinai as having this great big flat area, this terrace, below the summit upon which God is supposed to have stood. Well, on Jebel Madaba, there is a terrace that has been estimated to be cut there by the hand of man around about 3,500 years ago, and there are two huge obelisks there which are still described in the Arabic language as the feet of God. So there are many things like that that make me think that this is actually the real mountain where Moses received the Ten Commandments. Now, if that's true, then the type of rock that is on top of Mount Sinai is what the stones were made of that were put inside the ark. Now, these stones appear to have some rather strange properties. Many people today claim to witness strange balls of light that appear on top of this mountain, and various scientists have done research and have concluded this might be something that they describe as a
that happened this week. Paul Schaefer, the head of Colonia Dignidad in Chile for many years, has been captured in Argentina and deported back to Chile to face charges of child molestation, torture, and murder in Colonia Dignidad, allegations being made by the Chilean prosecutors. There is a groundswell of support building for him on U.S. skeptical websites on saying Colonia Dignidad was nothing but a little Christian community. The truth is that Colonia Dignidad may well have been an outsourcing location for CIA torture for many, many years. The CIA may have been using Colonia Dignidad as a center of torture outside of the United States, something we have just recently been discovering the CIA did a lot of for a long time. Therefore, the skeptics' websites, etc., that are CIA-controlled are going to be saying Colonia Dignidad was innocent. Now let's see what Peter Levenda has to say about that. Peter Levenda is author of the legendary book about post-World War II Nazi influence, The Unholy Alliance, and he is the author of an extraordinary 3-volume upcoming gigantic book, Sinister Forces, the first volume of which is going to be published this May. Here's Peter.
Paul Schaefer was an officer with the Luftwaffe during World War II with the German Air Force. Reports say that he was a medic with the German Air Force, not a particularly exalted title or position at the time. However, in the 1960s, he had to flee Germany because of allegations of child abuse. There were a number of questions about his abuse of children and kidnapping of children in Germany in the early 1960s. He left Germany and wound up in Chile, purchasing an estate which he renamed Colonia Dignidad, which means the dignity colony, colony of dignity or colony of righteousness. It's 35,000 acres, and it's in a very remote location in the south of Chile, near the town of Parral. Now, Schaefer in Germany was allegedly a kind of Baptist minister, and his colony is supposed to be a religious commune. Well, I first became aware of the colony through a book by Ladislas Farago called Aftermath. It was about the Nazis in hiding after World War II.
We like to talk to people who go there and do that, and that is exactly what you are. Is that right, Graham?
Yeah, I think you could describe me as an adventurer. I have been described by some of the press as a real-life Indiana Jones, so I suppose I'm the nearest thing you're going to get.
Okay, well, let's now, this quest has been undertaken just quite a few times in history. And I must say, by the way, the Templars and the Ark of the Covenant reads like something that would have been written by Indiana Jones. It's really loads of fun. In any case, this quest has been undertaken. Another Graham Hancock, early in his career, undertook a quest in search of the Ark of the Covenant. Now, before we get into where this quest led you and what makes this whole thing so special, which it certainly is, let me ask you, what about the Ark? What did it do? And what might it have been? So first, why don't you describe what it did? What did the Ark do?
Well, the first thing is not to confuse the Ark of the Covenant with Noah's Ark. Noah's Ark was the boat which the animals all went into during the Great Flood, supposedly, according to the Bible. But the Ark of the Covenant was said to have been a golden chest around about 2 or 3 feet high, 2 or 3 feet wide, about 4 feet long. And on top of it were supposed to have been carved 2 golden angels. and inside it were kept the Ten Commandment tablets, the 2 tablets of stone on which the 10 Commandments were inscribed that were said to have been given to Moses on top of Mount Sinai. But that's not all it was. It was made by Moses and the other Israelites when they were wandering in the wilderness after they escaped from slavery in Egypt, somewhere around about 1350 BC, thereabouts. And it's, of course, contained the 2 tablets of the 10 Commandments, but it was also supposed to have been some sort of holy weapon, because the Bible describes it as being carried before the armies of the Israelites and somehow managing to destroy the opposition. When the Philistines, for example, one of their enemies, attacked them, some think that it's described as the glory of the Lord, or divine fire seems to have come out of the ark, and
the rat lines that were able to move the Nazis out of Germany so they could avoid prosecution, and wound up all throughout South America and other countries. So I went down to check it out back in 1979, and I just wandered in there on a Sunday morning, and eventually was apprehended by the members of the colony, and my passport was confiscated, and I was asked a lot of questions by Paul Schaefer. Since then, Amnesty International, the CIA in its own studies of the colony, and a lot of other organizations have exposed the fact that the Colonia Dignidad was a center for torture and interrogation during the Pinochet regime, the torture and interrogation of political prisoners. The interrogation cells were actually devised and designed by an American, Michael Vernon Townley, who was involved in the assassination of Orlando Letelier in Washington, D.C. a few years after the overthrow of President Allende in 1973. So the colony is a pro-Nazi operation. There's going to be a lot of restructuring of history, of revisionist history going on about the colony as Paul Schaefer is brought to justice now. He was captured in Argentina about a week or so ago. He's been deported back to Chile to stand trial for the charges against him. When I say revisionist history, people are going to say the colony was a religious commune, that it was Christian in nature, that they didn't harm anyone, when all the evidence points to the contrary.
I can tell you right now, you're not going to hear a thing about this on any other radio broadcast in the English-speaking world. So you support this radio program and this website. You do that right now. Listen to this. Well, Graham Phillips is back with us, and I'm delighted because it's always a high adventure when you talk to Graham. Graham has been on the program twice for Atlantis and the 10 Plagues of Egypt, and for the Chalice of the Magdalene, the search for the cup that held the blood of Christ. Well, Graham Phillips is still searching. He is now on to the Templars and the Ark of the Covenant, the discovery of the treasure of Solomon. Graham is talking to us from Coventry, England, and he is not an armchair adventurer. We don't like too much to talk to armchair adventurers on Dreamland. Talk to a few of them, but we basically leveled the opposing army.
On other occasions, people who opened the Ark to look into it without the protection of special prayers and other sorts of things that were supposed to have protected the priesthood, immediately drop dead when they open it. But it's not only supposed to be a holy weapon, it was also said to have been something like, as it's described in the Indiana Jones film, a radio for talking to God. In other words, throughout the Old Testament, you get various prophets, such as Moses, who talk to God, and God reveals his plan for the Israelites. Well, most of these conversations with God are taking place by the Ark of the Covenant, and God is said to somehow speak through it, and sometimes he's even said to appear there, or at least something described as the glory of the Lord appears as some sort of divine fire above the Ark itself. So basically, in short, it was a holy weapon and a radio for talking to God.
That's absolutely fascinating. Now let's get back to the holy weapon aspect of it, because it's tantalizingly similar in the way it's described to what certain modern things might do, and also similar in certain ways to the Vedic literature, to this bizarre weapons technology that's described in the ancient Indian literature as well. Specifically, I refer to the idea that it might have been some kind of a particle beam weapon even that was used, that was generated by a high-intensity field of some kind. Could have been radioactive, could have been microwaves. How do you respond to the possibility that you're looking at a description of what was actually some sort of high-tech device that included an ability to communicate with somebody, as well as a
futuristic weapon of mass destruction sort of thing? Well, yeah. First of all, when I first investigated the Ark, I kind of thought, well, this is obviously the way that it's being portrayed, and a lot of these things were presumably myths and legends. I mean, I was originally looking at it as simply an artifact that existed in ancient Israel, and one which was obviously considered to be very holy, and that these myths and legends about